All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first live class together. I'm super excited. We had a guest presentation from Artés de México scheduled for today. Again, I hope that everyone's doing well in this really uncertain time. And hopefully, yeah, this presentation from Artés de México is going to go along with our theme that we've been really focusing on in the second part of the semester, which is art and the role of art and artists in struggles for justice. And I think Catherine and Fanny, who work in Artes de Mexico, are going to talk a lot about food as social identity and sort of their work more broadly around food and agricultural values and those kinds of things, but I will let them speak more specifically about that. So yeah, just really some logistical things. Let's try to, again, keep our microphones on mute during the presentation, and then in the Q&A, maybe try to use this chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you want to sort of get in order to ask a question. Maybe you can send me a message using the chat feature that you want to ask a question, and then I'll, kind of, let you know to ask your question. Or maybe we'll see how it goes. Maybe you can also just ask it in the Q&A. People can just jump in. So yeah, without further ado, let's hand it over to Catherine Aviles and Fanny Guadalupe from Artes de Mexico. Thank you all for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So we're going to introduce our organization a little bit, just in case you're not familiar with it. So our organization is called Artes de Mexico in Utah, and we use Mexican art to promote not only appreciation for Mexico and its culture and its people, but also to connect people and see parallels between Mexico and the US and also Utah. And we share different perspectives, and we use art as a way to introduce those perspectives and also different concepts and ideas and themes. Today we have our board chair, which is Fanny, and she is amazing. She knows so much about all of these themes going on in Mexico, and recently she went to Chiapas, so she can also share her experience there, and the artwork that is there to promote social justice. So I'm going to give her the time to go ahead and introduce herself.
Fanny, sorry to interrupt just for a second. There's a little bit of background noise and I don't know, some static or something that's coming. I don't know if everybody's on mute, but if everybody could just be on mute unless you're speaking, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I can hear the same. Okay, yeah, my name is Fanny Guadalupe Blauer. I am originally from Mexico City. I have been in the United States for 24 years now. I'll tell you a little bit about this project. This project started as an initiative to really understand the importance of, community gardens are kind of like a fashion, right? Everybody wants to build a community garden and everybody wants to plant. And then when I thought of this idea was, why is that we give importance to food, and where is food coming from? I joined we joined efforts with Wasatch Community Gardens, and I noticed that especially on the west side, Hispanic families were really inclined into planting corn and beans and squash and tomato. And then I thought, why is that people are specifically planting this? I know that they are part of our diet, but why that food? And then I realized that people carry their identity through food. So Artes de Mexico in Utah was able to develop this project on dipping in culture and food and identity and memory and the lack of and the loss of identity through the food that as we move to the United States, or as our families move to the United States, how is that we lose that cultural value? And how is that we try to preserve those cultural values as well? So I am gonna start by sharing with you the mission of this project. I'm gonna say keywords. Of course, community, culture, identity, naturally connected, sustainability, colonization, decolonization, economy, migration, and social justice. With this project, we are hoping that we all learn to value others' worldviews, ways of knowing, knowledge, systems, and science. There is science in everything that we do, even in an empirical way. Science starts there, and food is a way to show that food is science, and culture involved in food is also science. This project, it is a compilation of images, real images from either artists or photographers of current issues that are happening in Mexico and Latin America. So I'm gonna start with this picture. This project is called Food, Land, and Power. And I started by honoring this little girl. This little girl that you see in the screen is called Afrodita. Afrodita is a girl that lives in a little town outside of Mexico City in an area that is mostly urban. And Afrodita appears covering her mouth with a corn plant leaf. You can see in the back the cornfield. The image resembles what she saw at her grandmother's room in a picture from an old newspaper. And this is the image of a Zapatista woman covering her mouth. Afrodita's grandmother had told her that these women have been fighting for their land and culture for hundreds of years, fighting for their two things. So my friend from Chiapas, actually, who came here, she said, there's two things that can happen to you that are the worst. Number one, being a woman. Number two, being indigenous. So with that, you can imagine what it is to be an indigenous woman in a community where your rights are not respected or acknowledged. So this woman covered their faces as a symbol of resistance against the system that does not protect the ancestral values or the acknowledgement of their land. Afrodita, what she did is that she ran to the milpa, to the corpse, when the businessman came to her grandparents' little home with the intention to buy their land to take advantage of the proximity to the river. The author of this photography, he goes by Cro Munoz. You can find him in Facebook and Instagram. He is a muralist, a very radical muralist who really puts emphasis on painting his indigenous roots. And he's only in his 20s, probably 24 years old. And he told me this story. Eventually, the land was not taken from the family of Afrodita, but they are still fighting. And again, it's a very small area where people are fighting for to keep being sustainable, to grow their own food. And so that is the story of this image. So why is corn so relevant in the culture of the Americas? The Mayans and the Aztecs and many predominant cultures in Mexico believe that, especially the Mayans, there is this book called the Popol Vuh, and the book of the Popol Vuh, it's a mythology that explains the origin of life. We are all made from corn. And in this image, what you can see is that the corn husks, the corn cobs, are actually humans. Can you see that? See? This is a fragment of a mural symbolizing corn as the basis of man. This was painted about 1,000 years ago, and this was found in an area of Cacasla, Tlaxcala, outside of Mexico City. So what is milpa? Milpa, or the Three Sisters, or the crop system, is a system that was created when corn was domesticated. And we're talking about, 2,000 years ago. Corn, because of the type of land that existed in, or that still exists in this region of Mexico and Central America, was really prompt to give a very fertile land. So milpa, it's a combination of different plants that can be grown for eating purposes, including corn, beans, and squash. In the Native American practices here in the United States, the Native Americans call this the Three Sisters. In Mexico is a little bit more variety. So in Mexico, a milpa can contain chilies, can contain different spices, tomate, tomatillo, and that is a compilation of all these plants that can grow in one little plot or a big plot, which is actually the meaning of the word milpa. Milpa is from the Nahuatl word that means the bed that raises where you can plant, so milpan. So in this picture, what we see, there are major elements or the keywords that I mentioned. So can anybody tell me what you see in this image? Just tell me what you see. Anybody?
I
go
see
ahead.
a family
Good.
like drinking, I think it's water out of is it a jara, or how do you say those, a jug?
Yeah. I don't think it's a Coke, huh?
And then I see, oh, they're eating corn. And I think that's a baby cow.
Yeah, those are really good observations. Anybody else?
It almost looks like they're not really having a party, but they're kind of, together, having like a group.
Yeah.
You know.
So yeah, those are really good observations. So this painting, it's a modern painting, and it is actually based on practices that are still done in Chiapas and in many communities in Mexico or Latin America, I would say, where people celebrate their planting, people celebrate their harvesting. What you mentioned is key, it's a key factor. Everybody's together, everybody celebrates together. Well, some people are eating and cooking and drinking the pozol, that's the drink made of corn. Others are harvesting. You see in the right, there's a man harvesting, right? This is a practice that our friend Marilena, who came here last year, said that the people still do this because when people harvest corn, it's a way to give thanks to Mother Nature. It's a way where everybody collaborates, everybody's together. They celebrate the birth of their food that they are going to be. So when we think of this as a celebration, we're thinking collaboration, we're thinking sustainability, we're thinking everybody participates, right? So this is an image that was painted by a commissioner back in the 1800s. It's an image that reflects the Iroquois, if I am pronouncing correctly. Some of the Iroquois was actually not one indigenous group, but it was a group of several that were named that way by the French, actually. And what do we see here? And this is in the United States, in New York. Do we see something similar? Anybody? So the idea is that if we look at the previous picture and then this one, is that again, families are together, everybody's participating, right? It's a collaborative effort. And that's what Milpa, caring not about the idea of food is not only about what we eat, but how we produce this food. We all honor motherland, we all honor by being present on the harvesting. We're celebrating what the earth is giving us. And this is perhaps the base of this concept of harvesting milpa. Milpa carries a tremendous sense of identity. Here's a quote that is translated from that sign that you see on the right. The cosmovision of the native people has a deep relationship with our planet, our land, and the plants that give us life. The preservation of our ancient knowledge and natural resources will be a legacy to our future generations. So remember at the beginning I talked about ancient knowledge as empirical practices that lead us to understand scientific development of how corn works, for example. We can think of ways on how corn has evolved in the economic, has affected the economical development of the world. Can anybody give me an example? Maybe Alborz can ask a question.
Yeah, people, don't be afraid to jump in instead of using any kind of chat feature. So if you, yeah, do jump in.
Yeah, so this is supposed to be interactive. I don't want to be the only one talking and then you're going to fall asleep behind your screen.
Ask the question one more time.
Yeah, so when we think of this phrase that says the preservation of our ancient knowledge and natural resources, that is based on the theory of how we acknowledge the ancestral values, but also how those ancestral values evolved. So can anybody give me an example of how the concept of using corn, not only by eating it, but using it as a natural resource has evolved through time? So think of, for example, Monsanto, right? We think that the corn was started to be cultivated by these collaborative efforts by families or by little groups, right? Which brings community building. But Monsanto appears as one mono, as a unit that cultivates as a whole, right? It's mass production. How does that affect ancestral values or the preservation of cultural values?
Yeah, so what are some of the ways, y'all, we've talked about just how corporations might, farm corn and sell corn, and how that is different from how, communities, indigenous communities have farmed corn? What are some people's thoughts?
I was just gonna say, because don't big corporations or companies like basically like own the seeds, so like they I don't know what the word is, but so like other communities or indigenous people can't like plant their corn anymore, or what was it? Something like that. I just remember that they would like buy the seeds and claim them as their own.
Yeah, what is a mutation, right? Isn't it, Catherine? That's the mutation of the hybrids, right? Hybrids of corn. Yeah. So how is that we have lost our connection to our earth? Catherine, would you like to add anything on this screens?
Yeah, sure. I'll go over this one. So I'm pretty sure that you've talked about colonization in your class, and how colonization is still affecting a lot of Latin American societies today, obviously societies here in North America. But a lot of it started during the time of Christopher Columbus. So if you look at this image right here, who can tell me what are some observations that they can make in this image? Maybe some of the poses or the lighting.
I see the Spanish, their poses being more of a like an assertive pose.
Right. That's a good observation. What else?
I think I think I see indigenous folks in the background, sort of in the dark and hiding behind like trees.
Yeah. So yeah, great. So all of these are good observations. And it's not just this image. Like if you do a search and look through different images that portray indigenous people, like for example, John Gast, Manifest Destiny, that talks more about North America and having to expand because God mandated it. You see the same kind of lighting where the lighting is on Europeans or people from European descent, and where the indigenous people are in the dark. And if you see where the ships are, you can see that the light is coming from there. So you can see a few innuendos, a few things that are being interpreted here that are trying to say that the Spanish are here to bring light and knowledge, and meanwhile the indigenous people are in the dark, right? So there's that sort of rhetoric going on in there that's not being said, but it is being portrayed through this image and many other European images. But if we want to go to the next slide, Fanny. Oh, never mind. There's a missing slide there. That was my fault. From this, we have obviously the Columbian Exchange, and you have a different transportation of food coming in and out of the Americas. So at this point in time, because of colonization, now you have all these foods mixing in together. If you look at Columbus's journals, he even talks about how he tried to have some of the wheat and some of the European food grown here in the Americas. And so here Fanny has put the screenshot of these two pages that I grabbed from one of the letters of his voyages. He doesn't straightforward say European food is better than indigenous food, but he does insinuate a lot throughout all his letters that European food is wholesome and that it's best for European bodies. And there's a lot of insinuation that they were getting sick because they weren't eating European food. So even though they were amazed at all the different kinds of foods that they saw here in the Americas, there is some tone of superiority there that you can sort of read between the lines, very similar to the paintings as well. So I'm going to give the time back to Fanny.
Catherine, could we go back to the slide with the map to see the different foods that were, that's so interesting. So these were foods that were exchanged during colonization.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So it's from 1500. So if you see in the bottom, from the 1500s and then to 1650s. And obviously now we have even more of an exchange of spices and food on modern times.
Yeah, what is fascinating to me is that, well, we're talking about, colonization, decolonization, I always like to put the example to students, and maybe if we meet personally once, we can do this exercise. But think of a tomato, for example. Tomato is native of the Americas. And how iconic is the tomato in Italy, right? You can't think pasta without tomato paste, right? So it's interesting to think the story of the tomatoes, as the Europeans, when they brought the tomatoes initially to Europe, they thought they were poisonous. And then later on, it just changed the whole gastronomy of a country. Think of chocolate in the world, right? Chocolate comes from the Mayas, but from the Mayan region, but it really has explored a commercial delicatessen in the world. But what is important to say here is that every element of these foods have played a tremendous role in how we see food as a social status as well, right? So when we think of Italian food, for example, we tend to think of this fancy, I don't know, Italy is like a dream come true for everyone, right? We're going to Italy and we're gonna eat pasta in a tomato sauce in an environment that is very different from thinking we're gonna eat tomato, red salsa with chips or chips and salsa, right? So how the perspective changes as we utilize food. This image, when we think of, for example, Thanksgiving, we try to associate this event as a manifestation of reconciliation and happiness. But what I want to point out here in these two images is, one is an image that was painted, it's called the encounter, really, the moment when these two cultures come together. And it's painted by Diego Rivera, versus the other painting where the Native American and the explorer they are holding hands. So what can you tell me about what is happening in the left image versus the right image? And remember, I'm just gonna give you an insight here. Diego Rivera was a painter who was really, through his paintings in murals, was really putting emphasis on social justice and the recognition of identity as Mexicans. You know, he was one of the first Mexicans who publicly said, wait a minute, our art here is not depicting anything of what we are. We are dark skinned, we're brown. We are from these indigenous communities, and we are here in a centralized and industrialized city that is growing, or many different cities in Mexico, but we are the people who are coming from these indigenous regions. So can anybody tell me two differences that you see in those two paintings as we talk about the same subject, which is colonization?
So rich, y'all. I know y'all are observing some things. These are really two rich pieces here.
In the first one, it looks like they're like fighting, and in the second one, they're like shaking hands, I guess, or they're like holding hands.
Right. I would say that is the main evidence of how we interpret history, right? Here in the United States, we tend to think, again, to romanticize this moment of Thanksgiving. So it's about the perspective of the artist, right? Whoever painted the painting on the right is giving this impression that everything was just fine. You know, we came and we made peace and we civilized all these savages, indigenous people, and we learned from them, but here we are to teach you what's right. And on the left side is like, no way, you're not gonna let me win. We're gonna fight here because this is who I am. And if you look in the back of the painting, there's many different elements that represent the brown skin, you know, and the symbolisms that were important for the indigenous people, you know. plants that surround them, the feathers, the masks, the weapons that they use, the colors are very vibrant. So it is really the perspective of the artist who is showing what is real and what is not, and how through art we are able to depict what we want to believe, right? That's the power of art, I would say.
It's so interesting too how in that other painting on the right, the handshake one, that even the indigenous person is represented as being passive even in that handshake. He's not even really shaking his hand, but the European colonist is sort of holding his hand. It's almost in a child, like kind of as a parent would hold the hand of a child. I don't know. It's so, yeah. Even in that, you can kind of see there's some sort of unequal representation happening.
It's almost like giving up, right? Yeah. I accept everything that you are, and we also like to give several examples. For example, in our own city, you go to the Capitol building, and the murals that they have at the ceiling. So that's probably going to be your homework as you go there, and you see the paintings, and you can see what is the body position of the indigenous people that are painted on those paints. And it's the same attitude, same behavior. Is very humble, very kind of accepting, taking it for granted, that I am here to accept your enlightenment. Versus the other painting from Diego Rivera, which is extremely dramatic, and Diego Rivera is not as dramatic as Siqueiros or Orozco, where it's pure blood. The conquest is pure blood. Okay, so this image is the same. It's we were discussing in the minds of the Europeans. As Kat said, food played a role in the formation of social identity. I don't really know the source of this, but I remember reading something where the Europeans made a connection with the foods that they ate that had to grow from a tree. And so any foods that were growing on the ground were connected somehow with hell. And any foods that were growing from trees where you had to reach out to grab them, it's connected to heaven. Let's see. So food from the Americas. This picture is depicting some of the food elements that were found again in the Americas. You can see chilies, squash, avocados, chayotes, for those who know what chayote is. So food choices are influenced and constrained by cultural values that are an important part of the construction and maintenance of social identity. If you think about it, food is the easiest way for one culture to comprehend another. I think we are living in times where we have the ability to choose what food we want to eat when we go for a date, for example, or when we are going out with friends. And you think of, do you feel like Chinese, like Thai, Vietnamese? You feel like sushi? So think about the cultural connection that you're making through eating those foods. It is food that makes us part of wanting to be integrants of a culture, or the flavors, or the curiosity. We develop this curiosity through food, right? Food and language. We in the United States, we use a lot of words that are from indigenous roots, especially the Nahuatl. So think, for example, tomato. Tomato comes from the word jitomate in Spanish, from the Nahuatl, which is xiltomatl. Think of chocolate. Chocolate comes from the Nahuatl word chocolate. Think of chile, or think of guacamole, or so they call it now guac here, right? But guacamole is basically a combination of two words, mole de aguacate. It's an avocado mixed. So fusioning food is also fusioning language, and it's recognizing where these words are coming from. But again, when we talk about food and colonization and how we grow food, we have to recognize that these agricultural values, the agricultural practices that our people in indigenous communities are still practicing have to be threatened. Why? Because they are being threatened by many different contexts. Global trade, monopolies, environmental deterioration, impoverishment of rural areas, and then the values, of course, the values and the practices that create these relationships. The Zapatista movement in Mexico started back in 1994. And it started because for many hundreds of years, the indigenous people, the Maya people, particularly in Mexico, have not been recognized as a community that produces. They are isolated as indigenous communities, and that's it. So back in 1994, there was a revolutionary movement that started with these groups of indigenous peoples. They are recognized by them covering their faces with this bandana. And what they did is that back in 1994, the government had these areas kind of isolated. There were no main roads that led you to these mountainous areas. And they actually created a very strategic group of hundreds of people in this area among the mountains. 5 major headquarters that are called caracoles, snails. And then they rebel against the government to claim their sovereignty, right? They said, we deserve to be treated, we deserve to vote, we deserve to be equal in gender, and we deserve to be recognized in our ethnicity. So this is a movement that is not as strong as back in 1994, but it still exists. I was just there last December in one of those headquarters, and it's so interesting, this mural that you see in the back. It's an actual mural that I saw where people are really fighting. So what are they fighting for? Gender, equality, recognition of their gender and their ethnicity as people, because historically we see that indigenous people are seen as second-class individuals, and the protection of their land, which is the majority of the main purpose. They don't want enterprises to come. They want to protect their seeds. They want to keep them native and pure. And it's not really too much to us, but when we live in a global economy and in these governments where they want to take, right, it's almost impossible to survive. I love this quote of this man who is working the land. I'm a farmer. My father was a farmer, and his father was a farmer as far as back as we know. And you don't seem to understand that we don't want your welfare handouts or your political positions are meaningless to us. And your factory jobs are what we oppose. We want our sons and our daughters, their sons and their daughters, to continue to be farmers on our own lands, with our own languages and with our own cultures and with our own traditions. And this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're willing to die for. So this quote really simplifies the main reasons why this Zapatista movement still exists. And the reality of things is that it's not only the Zapatista movement. If we look, I'm sure you have studied in your classes that how many groups of people around the world are really fighting for this self-sustainability, right? This is an image that also shows the diversity of corn. There is about 65 different types of corn that are considered not necessarily pure, as your student said, but because I remember reading something that says there is really no a pure type of corn anymore because it's been modified in many different ways. But it's still people this type of corns that you see, the color, I actually have my corns here, and I brought these different colors and different seeds. Is you can see in this quote, our corn has allowed us to survive. Now our corn is suffering, and we must give back to corn what it has given us. We must help the corn withstand its suffering from the transgenic infections brought on by the greed of the transnational corporations and the bad governments. That way, corn and the people of the corn will both to be able to survive together. To me, this quote has so many symbolisms in terms of what people believe. You know, it's the natural resources part of this cycle of nature. And that's how we should be able to connect these ideas. We can't eat and we can produce without thinking who is giving us this food. And then I pull this, also this quote, and I'm hoping that we can give you all these resources. Oh, the link is actually there, but I translated this. And this was quite interesting to me. This was just, I just found this article about 2 weeks ago in one of the magazines from one of the persons who talks about what is identity in these Mayan regions. And it's quite interesting to me how they understand identity, because we tend to think, I think in our Western language, we tend to think as, when we think of identity, I think of myself, right? I am this, or I describe myself as this. But for the Mayan people, what they are saying in this sentence, in this paragraph, is that identity for us, the Mayans, it is an important word. However, in Mayan, the term identity doesn't really exist as a unit, right? There is one word, chilibal, which means the family that unites us. So, and it's not family necessarily connected by blood, but family as a way of life. That means, remember the previous images, is that where everybody participates. That's the family. And it cannot be understood, this family, this identity, cannot be understood without a space, or without elements that make up life. So when we look again at those images, what makes life? Well, the production of their crops, right? Being together, collaboration, sustainability, respect to the land. They are celebrating all together right at the site where they harvest to honor Mother Earth. Without the techniques of planting, which is milpa. So what makes a Maya a Maya? Well, it's this deep feeling that in Spanish we might call it, or in English, you know, this profound deep, but it's seeing life connected with everything. And when you connect with nature, it implies respect and it implies caring for it. I just find this fascinating as how we see identity. You know, I've been studying a lot of diversity and inclusion lately, but I've never seen anything like this as what is identity, you know, and I now I want to think that I like to think of myself, of who I am, but I also want to think of my surroundings as part of my identity, and how I connect with nature is part of my identity, how I celebrate nature and how I acknowledge nature. Here are some murals that I found in my last trip in Chiapas. I love the one on the right, I'm sorry, on the left, where it's again a corn, and it's a woman, and it's she is covering her face as a symbol of resistance. And what it says is "Somos raíz," we are roots. This is our root. This is our origin. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first image that we saw was of this girl called Afrodita. And Afrodita was later painted in the state of Chiapas by this artist, Cro Muñoz, without uncovering her face this time. Again, this is a real story, and I just love this story of a girl, you know, a little girl really trying to embrace her traditions and her roots and the protection of the land and the history, and what it takes for a girl to really demonstrate that, and for the artist to bring this story alive. Food choices are influenced and constrained by cultural values that are important part of our construction and maintenance of our social identity. And in that sense, food has never merely been about the simple pleasure of eating or consumption, but food, if we think about it, food is history and it is culturally transmitted. Food is identity and how we eat this food. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, in the absence of applause, I'll be the one to applaud. So we're all on mute. But that was really, really fascinating and informative. Thank you all for that presentation. So we'll just take a little bit of time for discussion and question and answer. So students, before we kind of get into it, I wanted to also mention, you taught us a lot about the Zapatista movement. And as Fanny had said, that is a movement that began in the 90s of indigenous Mayan people in Mexico. But what's interesting, it's very connected to what we've talked about this semester and last semester, especially when we talked about NAFTA. And, the Zapatista movement really gained ground during the period of NAFTA, when NAFTA was displacing, farmers in Mexico, forcing them to migrate, really basically forcing them to sell their lands, and really causing a devastating effect on farmers, because, of course, U.S. agribusiness benefited from NAFTA and those corporations were really the ones that benefited. And so the Zapatista movement really, said that food is not a commodity, right? Food is not a just product to be bought and sold. Food is a part of our identity. It's a part of our community. It's what sustains us, right? It's not something to be profited off of. Land is a part of our identity and community. It's not something to be profited off of. So, it's something that's really related to what we talked about last semester and this semester. But let's just jump into some questions. What are some questions you all have or comments on Fanny and Kat's presentation? Maybe one question to start us off is, what did you all think about how that quote that you put up on the screen, Fanny, about the Mayans and how identity, how there is no term for identity in Mayan, but rather there's a term for family. What did people think about that? What does that make you all sort of think about? Or if there are any other thoughts that people had.
I feel like me personally, when this slide came up, it sort of made me think of like the word identity, and when that word comes up, I just like focus on myself and my accomplishments, or like the people that helped me get there, or like the resources that helped me get there. And when I think about the word in Mayan, it's the family that unites us. It sort of gives me a background knowledge and like a little bit more reflection, and like it makes me acknowledge like my mother's and father's roots, and my grandmother's even. So I think when the word identity gets thrown out, I oftentimes like try to like make myself stand out of the story rather than connecting it, if that makes sense, altogether.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's interesting how language takes place, because if you read this in Spanish, the way this is written in Spanish, oh, someone is drawing. The way this is written in Spanish is this person talking and saying, well, you asked me what identity is, but that word is hard to translate. So every time we translate, we don't just translate, right? We have to adapt a cultural interpretation. And for putting this together when I put it in English, it really made me think, because language plays a huge role in how we see ourselves, but also our position with our society. Is there a language that makes us more individualistic, or a language that compiles us all at the same time? And I can tell that in this Mayan expression, at the beginning of the sentence is, I don't really know if there is this word, if this word really exists, because for us, identity is a whole, right? And that gives us a whole perspective of what is to build something together, or to claim something as a whole, right?
Yeah, other questions and thoughts about this really wonderful presentation? What did you all sort of think about the different images and how, we saw a lot of images, we saw murals, right, that people have painted. We saw images that colonists had created of the lands that they came to, of the Native Americans. We saw photographs. What do all people think about, the kind of impact these images have?
I thought it was interesting how it depended like who painted it or like whose perspective, because like here I'd say like in our history classes, like in public schools, I feel like everything was very one-sided as well. Like we only learned one side of the history and we never learned like the other side, like of like the other people's perspective. So I just thought it was interesting that it depends on like what perspective.
Absolutely. Other folks? Yeah, this was also another really great quote, right? What do people think about why is land so important to people, to the Zapatista movement? Why do you think land is so important? Why do you think farming is so important? Why is this something that they really focus on?
Is it something that they focus on because like it was passed down to generations, so like it's like a connection with their ancestors, I guess? Or
Yeah, definitely. How has this presentation made people think differently about food? The different foods we eat, and yeah, how has it made you think differently about food? I mean, we saw like the even just the names of the foods that we eat, where they come from, the origins. We always wait in a little bit of an awkward silence, Fanny and Catherine. So
It's okay. See.
So, to me, food is kind of for a lot of people, food is the central part of life. Um, but this presentation made me think a little bit different about food in the sense of kind of more of like a kind of like a bringing together of, you know, family, and more of a as a celebration of who you are. And actually, last night I just cooked some Filipino food, which my mother and I are Filipino, and we, you know, we created these dishes together, and I I take that for granted. And I guess this made me think more about that sense of, I want to say community, but I don't know if that really fits there.
No, it's very inspiring. Thank you.
I did want to mention that this particular presentation is part of a 3-part series presentation, and this is the last one. But in the previous one, where it focuses more about milpa and growing corn, and also about the 3 sisters and the crop system, that presentation that we've collaborated with the Natural History Museum, we talk also about how the milpa provides a solution to many of the problems that we are having in agriculture and modernization. So with the milpa, it's a companion agricultural system that the crops symbiotically help each other, where as opposed to monoculture now in the present, where you have to add chemicals to the crops, and that also affects us when we're consuming it, as opposed to when you have a companion crop system where all the crops are helping each other and providing the nutrition that they need, and also providing us the nutrition that we need. Obviously that's something that we couldn't cover in full, but I do want to see how the ancestral knowledge and the wisdom that indigenous people have practiced for millennia are actually the solutions that we need right now. We need to go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Yeah, what are, I'm really happy, Kai, you shared a little bit about like some of the food you all were eating in your house the other night. And what are other folks, other students, what are y'all's what kind of foods have y'all been eating? How do you feel? Do you also agree with Kai that food kind of brings people together? Is that had been your experience in your households, in your communities, families?
For me, during like this time where we have, I guess a little bit more time to be with family, my brother has finally like come over, and we actually like prepared a meal together. So that was like pretty fun. So, cause like he's always busy with like his real estate agent stuff, and so like him coming over and like us shopping, like quickly shopping at a store, to like get the ingredients. It was really fun, and it just connected us like a bit more. Yeah.
That's great. I'm just going to quickly give an example. I have something here on my, I don't know if you can see it. No, it's going to fall. But this is, put it here, as you can see. It's a bowl that I have different seeds. And think of, when you make a soup, all the ingredients that you put in a soup, right? And this really makes me think of the diversity, people. As we look at what seeds are in my hands, we have different seeds of corns, different types of corns, and different types of beans and squash, and I like to think of this as that quote from the Mayans: "It's all in one," right? And when you cook it, and it comes together with a delicious flavor. It's this compilation of everybody one, and then it tastes delicious, right? I like to think of that as a sense of community, sense of belonging.
Any other questions for our presenters, or thoughts people want to share? Well, thank you all so much. You know, I really enjoyed this presentation, and I think, you know, nowadays, I think it was you, Fanny, who were mentioning this at the beginning, that mentioned something about it sort of being trendy to talk about gardens, or food is kind of a trend, right?
Right.
Wellness, let's be healthy, let's eat healthy food, or even kind of the ways some people sort of talk about, oh, food is about connection, bringing people together, right? You know, can feel a little trendy sometimes, but really what you all have reminded us in this presentation is that food is about justice. It is about reclaiming communities, you know, knowledges, and reclaiming the resources and lands that really support a community. And instead of looking at food, again, through this corporate, profit-oriented model, we can really look to indigenous peoples that have, you know, for thousands of years, really, food has been a central part of how communities are created, and it's really about justice. It's really about, instead of these ways that we understand around exploitation and labor and trade relations and environmental degradation, there are different ways we can think about food as really strengthening the earth and strengthening our communities. So yeah, thank you both so much for this presentation, and for introducing us to Artés de México. Let us know if we can email. I'll post maybe some more info, like a website or an email of the organization for students, maybe if there are opportunities for people to get involved with the work that Artés de México is doing. Yeah, so let us know about that. Let me know about that. And thank you so much for this presentation.
Sure. Well, Kat, do you want to share our social media? We've been working on different campaigns, and so.
Yeah, so especially now that we have to do everything online, and for the time being, we do have a few opportunities. You can follow us on social media at Artes de Mexico in Utah, or you can visit our website. We have a podcast that talks about various different topics. It's a super well-made podcast, and I'm not just saying that because I work for Artes de Mexico, but it's very well made, and I think it's very interesting, and it's not long enough. Like, it's just 15 minutes where we talk about themes like this, and you're more than welcome to listen to that through Apple Podcasts or our website, artesmexut.org. So yeah, we have a lot of opportunities. We have 2 contests, a poetry contest and an art contest right now. You're more than welcome to participate in those.
Yeah, and actually the art contest is that we decided to name it Origins, and we are inviting artists to write out what do you consider to be your origin, you know, from the cosmovision or your own what is origins, what does origins means, and I think is related to this. And yeah, the podcast is in our social media and Instagram and Facebook, and yeah, we are hoping that we can have in-person classes. We are actually doing these classes. Alborz, you came to the community garden where we actually are doing hands-on. We did a mandala of flowers as we dedicated the seeds, and then we did the harvesting mandala for the seeds that we harvested. So it's a beautiful project that we love to see students involved in this. And so think of ways where you can collaborate with. Don't make food accessible. Just I like to think that food is for everyone, but food has this cultural value that brings us together. And these workshops give us that opportunity to reflect on that.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Before we sign off, just, I'll post this lecture online on Canvas, and you can go back to it when you're writing your discussion post, and expect the videos for our next workshop, our next spoken word workshop. Those videos are going to be posted end of day Thursday. And as always, feel free to email me with any questions about support that people need during this time. I know I've been sending you all a lot of emails, but yeah, I'm here to support folks. And yeah, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you again, Fanny and Kat, and thanks, Artés de México. This is really wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.